My name is Elisa, and I'm a technical support analyst on the VertiGIS Studio team. In this tech tip video, we'll take a look at some of the ways you can use inputs, commands, and operations from VertiGIS Studio Web in your workflows. Understanding how VertiGIS Studio Web and VertiGIS Studio Workflow pass information to each other can be a bit tricky, so I find it helps to imagine them as two separate boxes that are sealed off from each other, where some of the items in one box are written in a different language than the other box. Only the things you explicitly transfer from one box to the other, and translate if necessary, will be communicated. This can be done in the following three ways: using specific workflow activities, supplying input arguments in the app, and making use of viewer commands and operations. The first method, using workflow activities, is a bit like workflow reaching into the web box and either grabbing or placing an item there. It has a precise pattern for what it's doing, so the item is very specific and no translation is necessary. For example, the getMap activity grabs the currently active web map from the app, but it can't get any other type of information since it only knows how to find the map. The second method, supplying input arguments, is a bit like web tossing a bunch of information into the workflow box when the workflow starts up. It doesn't know how any of that information will be used, it just sends it over and moves on. In this case, some translation may be necessary on the workflow end depending on what web includes. This option is great for information that can't be accessed using a workflow activity, like the current selection of features. The final method, making use of viewer commands and operations, is a bit like workflow asking web for a favor in web's own language. Workflow doesn't really understand what the favor means, it just passes the request to web and waits for web to either say the task is finished or send something back. These two different behaviors are determined by whether the request is a command or an operation. When workflow asks web to run a command, web simply executes the request and doesn't generate anything to send back. But when workflow asks web to run an operation, web does generate some information and sends it back to the workflow box. Web does not explain its process to workflow, and depending on what web sends back, the results may need to be translated for workflow to understand them. Since using workflow activities to get specific information from VertiGIS Studio Web is relatively straightforward, we will focus on the latter two methods in this video. Let's start by looking at the various ways you can send input arguments to VertiGIS Studio Workflow and how you might process them. On the workflow side of things, we will want to start with a Get Workflow Inputs activity. Regardless of how you send the inputs to the workflow, this activity is necessary. Without it, there is no way to get at the inputs or reference them in other parts of the workflow. To keep things simple, we won't add any more activities for now. On the web side of things, the easiest way to send input arguments is to list them in the Input Arguments section of a workflow's settings. Let's add our newly created workflow so we can see these settings. We'll put it in the Layer Actions menu of the layer list. As can be inferred from the curly brackets in the Input Arguments box, the arguments accept JavaScript object notation, or JSON for short. Essentially, you want to supply key-value pairs, where the key is the name you choose to give to the input, and the value is the stuff you are trying to pass into the workflow. In our app, let's pass in something simple, like the name of our buildings layer. We'll choose an appropriate key, like layer name, add a colon, and set the value to buildings. If we want to add another input, we'll add a comma, enter a new line, give our input a key like max selection, and specify a value. Here, we skip the double quotes on the value because we want it to be formatted as a number instead of a string. Now, if we open our handy browser console and run our workflow, we see that the input arguments get passed into the workflow. One more thing you'll notice here is the context argument that we never explicitly set. This is a powerful tool that passes implicit information from your app to your workflow. For example, if you run a workflow from the Layer Actions menu, it will include the layer you ran it from in the context argument. Let's see this all in action. To start, we'll set up our workflow without using the context argument. Let's add a getLayer activity. This activity searches the web map for a layer based on its ID or name and pulls further information on it. We'll supply it with our layer name input from the web app. It's important to get the spelling right here because, remember, Workflow doesn't know anything about the input until Web tosses it over, so it can't tell if you've typed the input name correctly. Now, let's add a query layer activity. We'll feed it the layer from the getLayer activity, set it to query all features, and return all output fields. Then, set the limit on the maximum number of features based on our max selection input. Now, let's add a show results activity to display the features in the results list of the web app. When we run the workflow, our app shows us 5 features from our buildings layer. That's great, but if we try running the same workflow from a different layer, we still get results from the buildings layer because the layer name is hard-coded into the workflow arguments. Let's try using the context argument to make our workflow more flexible. Context always gets sent by default, so we don't need to do anything further here in VertiGIS Studio Web. Back in Workflow Designer, let's disconnect our getLayer activity. In the query layer activity, we will change the layer input so that it grabs whichever layer gets passed in via the context argument. To do this, we need to know how Web is storing the layer information within the context argument. Let's quickly go back to our web app to check. Based on what's in the browser console, it looks like we want the layer object in getWorkflowInputs1.inputs.context.layers. We'll plug this into our query layer activity. Now, when we run the workflow, the top 5 results match up with the selected layer. As mentioned earlier, an important thing to consider when passing input arguments from web to workflow is that some of the arguments may not be in the same language that workflow uses. This is especially significant when using the context argument since you don't have explicit control over how web formats it. There wasn't any issue in our layer example, but let's try something a bit different so you can see what I mean. Let's create a new workflow with a getWorkflowInputs activity. We'll put it in the Result Actions menu of the fire hydrants layer, which will pass the current selection of fire hydrant features in its context argument. Let's say we want to log the hydrant numbers of all selected features. In our workflow, we will add a getFeatureAttributeValues activity and set it to grab the features from the context argument and pull the hydrant numbers. Now, let's add a log activity to output the list of hydrant numbers in the browser console. When we select some features and run the workflow, the array of values is empty. This is because Web sent the features over in its own language, and Workflow doesn't know how to read off the attribute values without translating the features first. Put in more technical terms, Web uses VertiGIS feature objects to describe features, while Workflow uses the more standardized Esri graphics objects. To convert between the two, VertiGIS Studio Web has a couple operations available. The first one is results.toGraphics, which takes VertiGIS features and converts them to Esri graphics objects. The second one is results.fromGraphics, and it is essentially the reverse. It takes Esri graphics objects and converts them to VertiGIS features. For our case, we want the first one, results.toGraphics. To request our results.toGraphics operation from Web, we will add a run operation activity directly after getWorkflowInputs. For the operation parameter, we want to check how Web expects things to be formatted. In the Developer Center documentation, it says it directly accepts features as arguments. So, back in our workflow, let's feed the features from the context of the getWorkflowInputs activity directly in. It's important to format these arguments correctly. Though this one was straightforward because the value it expected could be fed directly in, some commands and operations expect the arguments to be formatted in JSON. We will take a closer look at that later. Now, we'll want to adjust the inputs of the getFeatureAttributeValues activity so that it accepts the translated features instead of the original features. Let's try running the workflow again and see what happens. As you can see, the log now returns the list of hydrant numbers for the features. The last thing we'll look at today are web commands. These are almost identical to web operations except that they perform a task without returning any results. They also need to be triggered by a run command activity instead of a run operation activity. Back in our original workflow, let's get rid of the show results activity and instead use the highlights.add command to spotlight the queried buildings. We'll add our run command activity and set the command name to highlights.add. Now, we'll want to check the accepted parameters. Once again, it says it directly accepts features as arguments, but what's important here is that it doesn't explicitly say that it accepts Esri graphics, which is what comes out of a query layer activity. To make sure it works as well as possible, we will want to translate our query results to VertiGIS features using the results.fromGraphics operation mentioned earlier. To do this, let's add a run operation activity right before the run command activity. We'll set the operation name to results.fromGraphics. But now when we check the accepted operation parameters, we see that there's this fromGraphicsArgs hyperlink instead of a list of direct arguments. This means the arguments need to be formatted as JSON. Clicking on the link brings up the argument definition, which shows all the accepted key value pairs. Only the graphics key is required in this case, and it accepts Esri graphics objects. Back in our workflow, let's set up our arguments. Since it's a JSON object, we need to start with an equals sign and an open curly bracket. We will put the key in double quotes, followed by a colon. Then, we want to feed in the Esri graphics from our query. Finally, we add the close curly bracket. Now, in our run command activity, we can feed in the translated features so that they get highlighted in the app. Let's try running it and see what happens. As expected, we get a number of highlighted features on the map. That wraps up our tech tip video for today. To sum it all up, we looked at how to add input arguments for a workflow to a VertiGIS Studio Web app, how to use the built-in context argument, how to run VertiGIS Studio Web commands and operations from a workflow, and how to convert between VertiGIS features and Esri graphics using the results.toGraphics and results.fromGraphics operations. Hopefully, that helps you create workflows that are more closely integrated with your web apps. As always, thank you for watching.